Thank you so much, Michael and Stefan and Glenn, for all of your remarks, and thank you for organizing today's event. We're delighted to see the Chamber of Commerce putting so much focus on this important issue at this important time, and we look forward to being in partnership with all of you at the Chamber of Commerce. As you say, I'm an old neighbor from the AFL-CIO, and I used to come over a lot. Actually, Wally Workman might be before all of your time, but he used to invite me to come over and debate him in front of all the regional chambers of commerce about trade policy. So it's nice to be back at the Chamber of Commerce in my old neighborhood. So, as you all know, combating all labor exploitation, including and especially forced labor in global supply chains, is a core focus of what we do at ILAB, the International Labor Affairs Bureau. So my team works every day to promote supply chain traceability, and we do technical assistance projects on that, to improve labor standards, to support local communities to reduce child and forced labor, to support governments, and I think that Stefan's point is very important, to enforce and implement labor laws effectively, and to promote worker-driven efforts to support social compliance around the world. So this is the big picture of what we do, and we also play, ILAB is proud to play an important role in the FLETF, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, where we, along with all of our interagency colleagues, are working to put together a workable strategy. And I appreciate Stefan's remarks about some of the challenges. I think some of these laws are new, and the implementation of these laws are new, but also the reach down into the supply chain, where the US law, the Tariff Act of 1930 and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, doesn't say get forced labor out of your immediate first-tier production. It says there should be no forced labor in whole or in part in goods imported into the United States. And that is a huge challenge. It's a huge informational challenge, but it's one that I think we'll all benefit from working together. And we know that a majority of cases of forced labor are found in the private economy, in both formal and informal businesses, about 86%. These individuals work in conditions of forced labor in homes, mines, factories, or fields, and they often work in places where labor inspectors rarely visit, and often where global supply chains begin. And we've seen this in the media pretty much every week. There are problems in the clean energy supply chain, from child labor in cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo to polysilicon, which is used in solar panels from Xinjiang. And seafood, there's been a new expose from the New Yorker. A reporter named Ian Urbina spent 3 years chasing fishing boats in the Chinese squid fleet, and also through the processing. And some of this turns out pretty horrific abuses of human rights and workers' rights. In 2014 and 2015, we saw exposés of abuse of workers on Thai fishing boats, many of whom were migrants from Burma and Cambodia. And we know that being a migrant worker puts workers at increased vulnerability. And so we know that these situations exist all over the world at this very moment. And we also know that protecting the core International Labor Organization workers' rights, including and especially freedom of association and collective bargaining, are at the center of the global efforts to address these challenges. So this is what I want to talk about today, is how do we put workers and worker-driven solutions at the center of what we do. And I think that actually can be useful for businesses because it spreads some of the responsibility. And I also agree with all the points that both Michael and Stefan made, which is that this is not just a moral imperative, it is now an economic imperative for businesses to figure out how exactly to make this, to address these supply chain issues to avoid interruption of market access or reputational damage, which can be also economically damaging. And so very much appreciate the point that you made about the necessity for business to be proactive, to get out ahead of some of these issues. And we also know, unfortunately, that child labor is not confined to faraway places, but happens in the United States of America. Last year, Department of Labor found 835 domestic-based companies employed more than 3,800 children in violation of the law on the United States territory, including one case where over 100 children, some as young as 13, were found working the night shift, cleaning the kill floor equipment at meat processing plants. These are egregious violations of our child labor laws, and it happens in a wealthy country like the United States with good laws in place, with an enforcement apparatus. But we know that this isn't acceptable here in the United States, and it's not acceptable anywhere else. And I think one of the things that I know from my work both at the AFL-CIO and also now at the Department of Labor is how connected we are. And I think the Chamber of Commerce recognizes this as well, that what we do at home affects what happens in the rest of the world, and likewise, what happens in the rest of the world affects us. And for the Chamber of Commerce, we know that the household name brands whose supply chains include or maybe even facilitate child labor at home and abroad have a responsibility to work with governments, with unions, with NGOs, to take responsibility for the labor practices that they profit from. And this should start with voluntarily accepting responsibility for any illegal labor practices and bringing the work that's feasible to bring in-house, to bring it in-house. Because let me just say, to be honest, to be candid here, get your attention for a minute, that the fissuring of supply chains, the increase in outsourcing and subcontracting, and the severing of employment relationships has been a deliberate strategy, not just to cut costs, although cutting costs, of course, is the primary piece of it, but also to sever the employment relationship, to not take responsibility for what happens further down the supply chain. But I would say that's not working anymore. It's not working because we are in a new era, and I think both Michael and Stefan read out some of the new legal protections between the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act with its rebuttable presumption, with the closing of the consumptive demand loophole in the Tariff Act of 1930, and with USMCA also requiring Mexico and Canada to implement forced labor import bans. And we are working closely with our counterparts in Mexico and Canada to help share information that CBP might have, how CBP goes about doing that. But I hear that all the time from European colleagues, from Australian colleagues, from the UK. Other countries are looking at the same issues. Consumers are up in arms, legislators are paying attention, and we are in a place where some of the luxury of ignorance that companies had with regard to their supply chains is no longer available. So we know that addressing forced labor in supply chains requires collaboration between all stakeholders, including business. And at iLab, we found some success in addressing forced labor through multi-sector collaboration, specifically in our multi-level collaboration with the private sector. One example is our Fair Fish program in Thailand. We've worked with private sector companies, recruitment agencies, on pilots for small and medium-sized enterprises. And as a result of this project, more labor inspectors in Thailand are visiting factories to monitor for labor exploitation than ever before. Companies and workers better understand each other's rights and vulnerabilities. And now the recruitment supply chains from Burma and Cambodia into Thailand are being mapped in detail to identify just how vulnerable a worker is to exploitation based on where they are from. We also have a project in the Democratic Republic of Congo, combating child labor in the cobalt industry, COTECO. And we are working there with private sector entities to increase awareness on child labor in the cobalt supply chain and to improve the monitoring and the remediation of child labor violations when they're found. So we want to establish a once-in-a-generation partnership amongst large-scale cobalt mining companies and the artisanal miners, the small-scale mining, which is where a lot of the problems happen, giving 28 mining companies and cooperatives the tools that they need to operate in this challenging context. And we know that, that these public-private partnerships are happening around the world, and businesses can do this not only through partnerships with public entities, but also through internal due diligence processes. And I know all of you have some of those in place. And I guess the question is, are they working? Do we have exactly what we need? And one thing is that we know companies can and should promote genuine transparency disclosures beyond the first-tier suppliers to know who they're buying from. And Stefan said how this is difficult. There's no question it's difficult to get down several tiers down. But I think it's also necessary because you are responsible. When those goods show up on American shores, you're asked not just whether there was forced labor in your top-tier supply chain, but whether there's forced labor anywhere in your supply chain. And so that is the responsibility. Another piece is that companies can ensure they are paying fair prices for inputs used to produce their goods. When global corporations knowingly or unknowingly squeeze farmers and subcontractors, they may not have a direct employment relationship with labor abuses, but they do share some responsibility. An example, this might be cocoa, where Nestle is not hiring children, but they are buying cocoa from farmers who bring their kids to work because they can't afford to put the kids in school or to leave the kids at home. And so the price that's paid is a key element that is under control. And I guess I'd say one more thing, which is that you all, businesses, especially big American businesses, multinational corporations, you have a lot of power when you go to other countries to tell them, we don't want regulation, we don't want taxes, we don't want minimum wage, we don't want unions. Those kinds of messages to developing countries undermine the ultimate goal, which is to have a government that has the resources to enforce their own labor laws, that will put in place labor laws that are effective. And finally, the last piece is that workers around the world benefit from employers who empower their voices. So freedom of association, collective bargaining can help bring to light abuses that may not be apparent in periodic audits. And I would just say, from a business point of view, a union can be one of the most effective and efficient and cost-effective forms of monitoring, where the workers are on the floor. You don't have to parachute in people in suits from faraway places to come and do a one-day visit, because you have people who are there on the factory floor, in the fields, in the mines, that are elected by and trusted by the workers, who can bring problems to light if that's what we want to do. So there are a lot of other efforts happening now, that worker-driven social responsibility, enforceable brand agreements like the Accord in Bangladesh, which is now expanded to Pakistan and may be expanding to other countries as well on safety and health in the garment sector, but also the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida, where the big brands use their power, they use their names to ensure that there are better conditions throughout the supply chain. So this year we relaunched our Comply Chain tool as a web-based platform to better feature the 8-step guide to building a worker-driven social compliance system. And unlike traditional compliance systems that rely on audits and inspections that are conducted by third-party organizations or brands, worker-driven social compliance systems prioritize the active involvement and empowerment of workers themselves. In a worker-driven social compliance system, the workers play a central role in identifying and addressing labor rights violations, health and safety issues, and other workplace concerns. They're organized into independent, democratic organizations or worker-led committees, representing their collective interests and leverage to advocate for their rights. Mapping a company's supply chain is an essential first step in addressing these risks. Risk and impact assessments are fundamental to identifying child labor and forced labor downstream in supply chains. And this is why it's so important that you don't stop at the first-tier factories and production facilities in your supply chains, but also use some of these tools to learn about the practice of second or third-tier suppliers, including agents, vendors, and contractors. So Comply Chain remains the organizing framework for multiple U.S. government agencies' ongoing work on child labor and forced labor, supply chain-focused research, and projects related to responsible business conduct, including DHS and Commerce. Comply Chain suggests that companies cross-reference their sourcing data with their worker-driven social compliance data, including worker organization reports, survey data, and other forms of worker voice, because we know that workers are the best on-the-ground barometer we have for supply chain risks. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, and I know she will be later on, my colleague and director of our Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking, Marcia Eugenio, will provide some greater detail as to how our Comply Chain tool works in practice. But in closing, I just want to stress what I see as a long-standing false dichotomy between good business profits and protecting workers' rights. Because I think we all agree, and I know you all do, that all jobs should be good jobs that provide dignity, rights, and protections. And for long-term sustainability and competitiveness, and to have a good consumer market, it's good to have good jobs out there. But creation of good jobs, both at home and abroad, makes good business sense. Worker-driven social compliance gives us an opportunity to make sure that good jobs are sustained up and down the supply chain. So if we empower workers, we give workers a voice, we have legitimate worker organizations that can be partners to business in assuring compliance throughout the supply chain, that can be a really important step forward. And I think it also, just to say, and maybe there'll be more conversation about this later, but that some of the voluntary efforts that were put in place, as well-meaning as they were, haven't always worked, and we saw that in Bangladesh. We've seen it in a lot of places where the voluntary social audits that are paid for by companies do not always turn up some of the problems that are there. So when we work together to provide good jobs for workers, we're supporting good businesses as well. And I believe that in my core. I've never thought that when I was at the AFL-CIO or in the US government that advocating for workers' rights was something that was going to be a burden for business. Rather, it is something that is an opportunity for business to be able to have the sustainability and the security and the resilience in supply chains, but also to have the peace of mind that there will be no market access issues or reputational problems from some of these very egregious workers' rights problems that can occur around the world without that kind of oversight. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be here with all of you today, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of you.